The Weight of Expectations by Amanda Jeffrey. Cytherea hacked at the ground with a mattock, her shoulders burning with the exertion. The ground was heavy with clay and resisted her efforts to dig out the trench surrounding the camp. She'd been awake since 2 bells before dawn, and her whole world had narrowed to the tool, the dirt, and the ditch. She scraped the now loosened earth to the ditch wall and almost jumped out of her skin when her universe of dirt and iron was invaded by a pair of boots. "Good morning, recruit." Durand couldn't do better. The voice seemed unfamiliar for a blink. Cytherea looked up to see the boots were attached to Proctor Corporal Pell, the officer overseeing her test for the Dauntless Vanguard. In the dust and evening light, her gold armour and halo looked beautiful, a broad-shouldered guardian with an offset nose and enormous grin. "Oh, I'm so tired, I'm hallucinating. It's no east wall." Cytherea's mouth felt gritty and dirty after hours of silent work. Beyond, fresh shifts of soldiers were digging the rest of the trench, but Cytherea had been here, with scant rests, all day. "Come on, leave the rest to the regulars," says Pell. "You still have sunset watch after this. Time to eat before then." Pell vaulted out of the ditch and held out a hand. Cytherea took it gladly and let Pell pull her up, long past caring that her stinging red hands were covered in clay. She was about to start walking back into the camp when Pell caught her shoulder and shook her head. Oh, she'd forgotten her pack. Cytherea reached down for her backpack and, without even the energy to resent it, hauled it on her back. Inside were simply rocks, but recently the pack had been her constant companion as much as Corporal Pell had been. Every time in the last 2 weeks when Pell had ordered that she march, walk or run through mud and rain and worse, the testing required that she bore half her own weight on her back, weighed down like that. Cytherea and her fellow aspirants had endured meltwater river crossings, unannounced night runs, and retreats across enemy territory with a much larger Pell posing as an injured comrade on an improvised litter. Each rock had been signed by a soldier in the Nymph Battalion, each one a friend and former comrade of hers. That first week she'd fantasised about losing 1 or 2, but seeing their names there, knowing the Demacians they represented, they felt a little lighter after that, but not a lot lighter. Her trials had magnified since then, but if she could make it, if she could become one of the legendary Dauntless Vanguard, well, her heart ached when she thought about how proud her family would be. Pell strolled forward, and Cytherea followed obediently. They stepped aside to allow a surveyor and a column of soldiers carrying gateposts past. When Cytherea first signed up to become a soldier, she found the commotion of army camps overwhelming, but now it filled her with pride. Hard-working Demacians with clear goals and a shared vision of this tiny pocket of a safer, more orderly Demacia, a haven against the dark. As they reached the mess fields, Cytherea saw soldiers dunking hunks of fresh bread into bowls of steaming hot stew, handed out by boisterous war chiefs. The smells were intoxicating, and Cytherea's stomach raged. But Pell wasn't slowing down. Cytherea locked her eyes forward and followed. How could she prevail in battle as a vanguard if Stu could threaten her focus? Pell pointed out a vanguard standing next to a crowd of soldiers. "Eyes up, recruit. The fellow over there is called Bunda. Knowing him. There's a stones tournament in play already." Cytherea could see 2 players sitting around a table at the centre of the commotion. Huh? So even Demacian's finest enjoy a game of tailstones. The corporal gave Cytherea a sideways look. "Are you any good?" Cytherea thought back to countless games played with her father, how she'd practised and practised until he had confessed he'd stopped letting her win a long time ago. She'd been known as the one to beat in her last squad with the Nymph. "I do alright." Cytherea finally got her bowl of rich, dark stew and immediately burnt her tongue trying to spoon it into her mouth. "Easy, recruit. Sit down to eat, at least." Cytherea must have looked sceptical, so Pell reassured her. "I swear, I'll not interrupt your supper." Sifra fought the impulse to wolf down the entire portion. While Pell had put her through near constant hardship these last 2 weeks, she'd never lied to her. Maybe faith in her comrade was part of the testing too. With as much restraint as she could muster, she put her spoon down and instead filled a flask with water before heading towards a log bench. Nearby, a raucous game of tellstones was just finishing around a makeshift table fashioned from a tree stump. One of the war chiefs was winning at 2 points to 1 against a raptor scout. The other cooks were making faces and clanging pans to try to distract the lean salt and pepper haired rider. She sat poised, missing nothing despite their bluster. Sifra noticed the scout's lip faintly moving as she slightly recited the order of the stones to herself. "What do you think, folks? Time for a little peek?" the young chef called. "Peek, peek, peek," the crowd chanted back with great pantomime. He picked up a stone and showed it to those standing behind him. Feigning shock, Sifra caught a glimpse, and her heart sank for the scout. She was repeating the wrong sequence of stone names. The match didn't last very long after that. Sifra hid her disappointment behind mouthfuls of dinner. 2 new players took a seat at the centre of the crowd. Bunda, the dauntless vanguard from Pell's squad, was a lanky young man with mousy hair. He had challenged another vanguard soldier with wiry muscles and a scar on her cheek. A new game started, but this was not the tellstone Sifra was used to. The 2 opponents stared silently at each other with an intensity Sifra had never seen. The crowd around them was growing much larger and mirrored their silence. It took a moment before Sifra even realised the game had begun. Without a word, the 2 soldiers broke eye contact to flick their gaze down at the stones, silently prompting their opponent to carry out the game's moves. It was faster than any match she'd ever seen, and it didn't seem to follow the rules she was used to. Pieces were added, moved, flipped, and identified without words. Startlingly, the scarred woman rapped the top of the tree stump once, looking up to stare coolly into Bunda's brown eyes. He breathed the name of the stone while simultaneously revealing it. Sifra realised she stopped eating, holding her spoon halfway to her mouth in awe, convinced she'd shatter the player's concentration if she put the spoon back in the bowl. She silently took the mouthful of cold stew, back and forth, knock and whispered response, expressionless and blindingly fast. The woman's knuckles rapped twice on the log. Nothing happened. The player's stares froze. There were no glances, no movement of stones. Sifra tried to see what they saw, but not a muscle moved, still as petrified status. Finally Bunda stood, face flushed with what seemed to be sudden fury, before breaking into an enormous grin. The crowd cheered, and both received slaps on the back in celebration. Bunda laughed and slowly applauded his now smiling opponent, the apparent winner of the match. Pell appeared beyond Sifra, almost making her drop her spoon. "Ready for a match? You said you'd do all right, after all." Sifra shoveled the last cold spoonful of stew in her mouth and made an apologetic shrug. She couldn't be less ready. Pell laughed. "Fine, fine. I said you could finish eating after that. We're teaching you how the vanguard play." She sat with a dull thump on the log bench, Pell's hand firmly pushing her down. In front of her was another stump table, rough hewn and fresh from clearing for the clamp, with a set of tellstones pieces laid out on top of it, an acutely important detail drawn on her. She was sitting opposite Sergeant Merrick. He was the leader of the dauntless vanguard's first shield and the long-standing mentor and second-in-command to Sword Captain Garen Crownguard himself. Sifra sat bolt upright, the backpack digging into her lower back, trying somehow to stand to attention while sitting on a log. Merrick watched her, a stern, craggy face thoughtfully taking her measure. Sifra fixed her eyes forward, uncertain of what was expected of her. Pell crisply saluted Merrick. "She's all yours, Sergeant." "Thank you, Proctor Corporal Pell. I'll take it from here." Pell hunkered down at Sifra's eye level, an uncharacteristically reassuring expression on her face. "You're going to do fine, Sifra. It's just a game. But in case you were wondering, This is most definitely part of your testing to get into the Dauntless Vanguard. Good luck. Sifra's mind raced, remembering all the stories she'd heard since joining the army of the legendary Merrick hacking his way free of an augur beast's grasp. He tracked it for close to a month after he had destroyed 4 fishing vessels and finally caught it during a night storm, or when he and Garen had fought back to back. It was 3 months, Merrick interrupted her thoughts. Sifra started, about now, even sleep-fogged. You're going over what they've told you about me, things I've done, battles I've won. I'd say you'd have gotten the augur beast's tale by now. It's written on your face. Sifra felt her cheeks redden. But we're not here to discuss what I've done, soldier. We're here to see what you might do, what you're capable of. Merrick's words hung heavy in the air. He nodded, once seemingly to himself. Can you follow orders, soldier? Yes, Sergeant. Sifra's voice cracked and she winced. Great. Now he thinks I'm some nervous raw recruit staring at her feet. Look at me, Merrick ordered. Sifra blinked in bafflement for a second before looking up. Her eyes took in his worn but perfectly maintained armour, old scars hatching the skin below. No, soldier, my eyes. Lock eyes with me. That's an order. Sifra felt her cheeks burn. Trying to look into the sergeant's eyes made her want to bolt from the camp and return to her old comrades in the Nymph. Maybe I should quit now. Would suffering the Nymph's disappointment be easier than the Vanguard's pity? No. She could do this. Fiercely determined not to fail, she fought all her urges to look away. Merrick was doing something with the game pieces. Without looking, he had picked them up, click and clacking as he shuffled them from hand to hand. Again, she fought the temptation to break eye contact. She saw him slowly holding up one of the stones, close to her line of sight, the tiles pointing in her direction. Keep your eyes on me. What tile is this? Merrick's voice was quieter now, calmer. Sifra scowled. She knew the Tailstone's icon, of course. She wasn't a child, but being asked to look without looking seemed absurd. She let her eyes relax their focus as she tried to concentrate on the edge of her vision. She could make out that it was a narrow shape, longer than it was wide. That could only mean the sword, Sergeant. She felt a tiny surge of triumph. Ha! Because identifying a game piece means I'm ready for the Vanguard. Merrick didn't even nod. He immediately placed the tile on the table, face up between them. With a clack, he brought up another tile and another. Sifra identified them as the scales and the shield. Clack, clack. I'm actually getting the hang of this. Her weary eyes were drying out, and she reminded herself to blink. I'm going to look down at one of the stones on the table, and I want you to tell me which one I looked at. Understood, soldier? This is too easy. Is he playing a trick on me? She nodded. Yes, Sergeant. A moment passed. Very deliberately, his eyes glanced down to her right and then, with a leisurely blink, returned to look back at Sifra. Her mind raced. The sword is in the centre, I'm sure. Then the other two on either side. It had to be the scales, the sword, the shield, from her left to her right. So if he looked to her right, then it must be the shield stone, she hoped. The shield, she says, with more confidence than she felt. Merrick rumbled a quiet grunt of approval and nodded almost imperceptibly. Again, his eyes flicked down to the middle of the table and back up to Sifra. She was ready this time and responded immediately. That's the sword, Sergeant. He reached out to the tile and she watched him flip it face down. Eyes up, soldier, Merrick admonished. Ugh, just when I thought I was beginning to appear competent. I've got to focus. Sifra adjusted herself on her log and solidly planted her feet, bracing her tired body and her ever-present burden. She met his gaze once more. Without a word, Merrick reached down and, from the sounds, seemed to be turning the other two tiles face down. Even if she looked now, it would be no help. Quick as a blink, he glanced down to Sifra's left and then back at her. She had been waiting for this and almost stumbled over her immediate response. "Scales, Sergeant." He then looked, quite deliberately, off to the right edge of the table, far beyond the 3 stones. He returned his gaze to her and slowly raised a questioning eyebrow. He clearly not looked at the shield, scales, or sword, and he had been very obvious in what he was doing. This was, as Pell had told her, part of the testing. She felt a frown forming on her brow. From frustration or concentration she couldn't quite be sure. If it wasn't the 3 stones in front of her, what could it be? Suddenly, she remembered that Merrick had left the other unused stones off to the side. "The pool, Sergeant." He had took a moment before replying, measuring her in some way she could only guess at. Aye, more specifically the hammer. That'll come with practice. His gaze never wandered, never became a stare. "What do you think I'm doing this time?" Barely daring to blink, Sifra still almost missed his glance, this time straight down at the middle, then snapping immediately to her left. He had changed his mind on what stone to pick. She stared and stared at his eyes without really seeing them, as her mind raced and she considered what he'd done. The sword and the scales? The corner of Merrick's mouth rose a little, and his cheeks creased, an unexpected smile, and he broke eye contact, freezing her eyes to do the same. She breathed a sigh of relief. "Not bad, Soldier Sifra," Merrick mused. "You could tell when I glanced at a single stone what move in tell stones. If you know the game at all, do you think that could signify?" Despite her newfound freedom to look anywhere she pleased, she found herself gazing at, or more specifically through, one of the stones on the table as she wrestled her exhausted mind to find an answer. The only information a single glance gave was about that lone piece, and so far she realised he hadn't looked at a face-down piece. "I would say you're trying to give the hide command, Sergeant, because that's not enough information for it to be anything else." Merrick focused on gathering up the pieces, purposely not looking at her. "Go on," Sifra continued. "When you glanced at 2 stones, that could have been the swap move, and when you looked at the pool, well, that has to be the place move, where you had a stone from the side. You're able to communicate the game moves without even speaking." Merrick neatly laid the stones on the side of their impromptu table, arranging them in a neat row before sitting back on his log and taking in the mess field around them both. He seemed in no hurry to acknowledge her revelation. "Where do you hail from, soldier?" he asked out of nowhere. "Cloudfield, Sergeant," she replied, surprised at his question. Cloudfield. Didn't they celebrate Yellow Spring Festival recently? How did he know that? Sifra's mind raced. "Yes, Sergeant. Usually I'd have missed it, but the hills bloomed early this year, and I was still on leave." "And your family?" Merrick seemed honestly interested, casually leaning forward with one forearm on his knee. "They still live there?" "They do. Yes, Sergeant. My niece was one of the flower bearers this year, and my father kept busy running around after her with her basket. He was so proud of her. I was too." Merrick was nodding, and Sifra realised she felt much better. The lump in her stomach was gone. Hardly anyone outside Clayfield even knew about the Yellow Spring Festival, but somehow Sergeant Merrick did. "There are 2 variants of tellstones in the Dauntless Vanguard," Merrick says. "Drawing the Lines, and the silent training version you saw earlier. Drawing the Lines is reserved for more serious disputes. So Sifra of Cloudfield, let's play some silent stones." "Yes, Sergeant. While we're playing, you can just call me Merrick." A smirk crumpled his wrinkled face. "Though if I catch you doing so outside of the game, you and your corporal will be on half rations until the physician stops smiling." Sifra must have blanched, because Merrick laughed at her reaction. "Is this still part of my testing?" Sifra hoped she didn't sound so nervous. She just wanted to be clear. "Perhaps, as Proctor Corporal Pell wisely likes to say, consider every moment of this month to be part of the testing and..." like all of us. Every day in the Dauntless Vanguard, another test to prove you're worthy of a mantle. Merrick's expression was sombre once more, and Sifra felt the weight of his words keenly. He paused, then asked, "Any more questions before we begin?" Bunda's game flashed through her mind. Most of it she now understood, but a few moments remained unclear. Replaying the game in her mind, she found her hand moving, mirroring what she'd seen. She rapped once more on the tree stump. "That's the challenge." Sifra spoke slowly but with certainty. One remained. She looked back up at Merrick and knocked twice on the stump. "And this is the boast," she stated. "But after that, Soldier Bunda just gave up?" Merrick made a most undignified choking sound, and his eyes widened half in shock and amusement. "Gave up? Bunda?" He looked around at the nearby soldiers and found who he was looking for. "Corporal Pell," he called, and she hustled over. "Soldier Sifra here," says she observed, during an early game of stones. "Soldier Bunda giving up. Can you confirm this?" She stood at attention, but Sifra watched as Pell's face twitched wildly to suppress a smile that threatened to rampage across her face. "No, Sergeant Merrick, I cannot." "Then can you explain what Soldier Sifra saw?" Amusement dripped from Merrick's every word. Soldier Bunda evaluated the situation, his own capabilities, and the capabilities of his opponent, and concluded that a protracted engagement would not result in victory or honour, Sergeant. He opted for an abbreviated conclusion and preserved his strength for more worthwhile future encounters. Pell seemed to have this well rehearsed, and managed to keep a straight face through most of it. "Very good, Corporal Pell. You may return to poorly spying on our game." "Yes, Sergeant." Pell made it several paces before her stony facade collapsed and she broke out in a grin. Returning to a nearby bench where she sat laughing with a few others of the Dauntless Vanguard, Merrick explained to Sifra, "Soldier Bunda is a Dauntless Vanguard through and through. I'd stand shoulder to shoulder with him against 100 Freljordian raiders and consider it good odds." His voice lowered, somewhat conspiratorially. "He has, however, been known to be stubborn. What you saw as giving up is a rare victory in a war he'd been fighting for years against his greatest opponent." The sound of Merrick's knuckles hitting the log stump startled Sifra. "One knock. That's to indicate you accept the boast, and I get a point." He rapped twice. "Two if you want to turn the boast back on them, and if you want to call their bluff, simply sweep the table with your gaze, indicating all of the stones, forcing them to name them all correctly or lose the game." Merrick leaned back on his bench. "Now, let's play. Pell said I should go easy on you, but I don't think I need to give any quarter to the 4th-time Tellstones champion of the Nymph Battalion." He raised a fiercely bushy eyebrow as he watched her reaction. "Ah, yes. I suppose the Yellow Spring Festival wouldn't have been high on the list of things he could have heard about me. Captain Eldrin would take it as a slight on the battalion's honour, I assume, if I underestimated you." "Yes, Sergeant, she would." Sifra adjusted the pack on her back. "I'm ready to play." They settled into the first turns of the game, Sifra focusing for all her worth on holding Merrick's gaze. Stones were placed, hidden, and swapped, and, while nowhere near the blistering pace she'd seen the sergeant's squad play, she hadn't made a fool of herself quite yet. Suddenly, an out-of-breath soldier interrupted her concentration to report to Merrick. Sifra stubbornly refused to let her gaze wander, the order of the pieces wriggling away from her like a line in rough seas. From the edge of her vision, the sergeant acknowledged the runner's update and effortlessly picked up his turn where he left off. "What do you think of this version of the game, soldier?" "Don't break eye contact. It's strange. Much harder, but it seems..." She hesitated to speak. It felt treasonous to voice these thoughts. "Go on." His voice was relaxed in spite of the tense game. More stones placed. Another pair swapped. She was having to concentrate on so much at once. There was the order of the stones, the turns, the new way of playing moves, and especially sharp rock, probably Eldrin's, in her pack digging into her spine and having to keep her eyes in check. In the end, she just blurted it out. It feels uncivilized. Her face fell at the shock of what she just says. I mean, I don't. There was no way to unsay it. Not honestly, and he'd immediately see through any attempt to weasel her way out of it. His hand moved suddenly, and she was so tense she almost flinched. He knocked on the log stump. Siffra was so flustered, she missed which stone he'd glanced at. Her fist flexed reflexively in frustration. She just shook her head. She took the peek action and glanced at one of the stones. Merrick waited, expecting her to look at the other two that were her due after a failed challenge, but she refused to move. She didn't deserve it. Uncivilized, eh? He said, placing the last stone. Why do you say that? It's impersonal, brutal, not like play. All the stones were hidden by now. Siffra felt her palms starting to sweat. Impersonal, he says, maintaining his gaze for longer than usual between turns. I can see how it might seem that way to others. I was raised to believe that honesty and openness are two of our greatest strengths, and sometimes it can be easy to hide intentions behind noise and distraction. The eyes tell you so much about a person, what they're thinking, how they feel. I think I know you better now than if we'd play 100 normal games, Siffra. He held her bare gaze for just a second more before he returned to the game. Stones swapped places, and she struggled to focus through the realisation that she'd felt like she knew and trusted him more than she'd ever expected. The game was becoming ever more complex. They'd not seen a stone's face for a dozen or more turns now, and the score was at 1 point apiece. If this were a normal game, she'd be ready to call a boast. But now, she couldn't put her finger on it. But Merrick's eyes told her it wasn't time yet. A flurry of turns followed. She faintly recognised that there was a real crowd around them now, hushed for the most part, but she let them fade into the background. How much of her selective focus was intentional and how much was exhaustion she couldn't spare the time to decide. A pair of engineers arrived with a quandary for Merrick about the location of the 5th and 8th shield campsite, and again he responded patiently. You said it was brutal, he said in the middle of a flurry of swapping stones. Demacia was forged in a brutal time. We train, we fight, and we protect so that we never have to suffer that brutality again. This game might appear brutal compared to other ways to play, but it's only a game, Siffra. Of course it's important you understand the Dauntless Vanguard must face brutality, violence, sorcery, and horror that no Demacian, not even other soldiers, should ever have to suffer. Every Vanguard understands that they might die in lands foreign or near, at the claws of some terrible beast or even the hand of their comrades. If they find themselves turned into something unnatural, every soldier who wears this armour knows their ultimate purpose is to give their all, even their life, so the Demacians can build homes and raise families and enjoy their yellow spring festivals. Siffra flushed. I know, Sergeant Merrick. That's why I'm here. I've read the stories, and I've seen more than most of my squad mates can stomach, but all it makes me feel is angry. Angry that there are Demacians suffering and dying because we weren't there. Angry that I wasn't there. Siffra felt her heart thumping in her chest and ears, and her hands were in fists. All right. Merrick nodded slowly, and she saw something like approval in his eyes. It's your move. She took a deep breath and forced herself to calm down. Is he trying to get me to lose control? Testing if I can keep a cool head, or if I'm Soldier Bunda without his better qualities? Well, I have better qualities too, Sifra flicked her eyes down to call for 2 of the tiles to be swapped, and they were back into the game, faster than ever. Yet another soldier hustled over with questions for Merrick, and Sifra found herself irritated at the interruptions. While the soldier droned on, she'd heard Pell's voice whispering from behind, "We've got your back, recruit." Confused, Sifra actually listened at last to the soldier, who was apparently speaking nonsense. "So obviously, Sergeant, the second shield new sword will stay under the smith's hammer for the night. We simply can't scale production without... I can't do it. Crown. Knight. Scales, hammer, flag, sword. You can do it, Sifra." Another laughing soldier elbowed the distracting soldier in the ribs and dragged him away, still yelling random stone names at Merrick. Merrick grinned. "It seems you already have allies willing to fight with you, even against me." They got back to the game. Sifra realised she wasn't entirely sure if the shield or the flag was where she thought it ought to be. It was definitely one or the other. But keeping it straight in her head was getting harder the longer they played. "We play this game to know and trust each other. That's why it's a game of war," said Merrick, "but not in the way you might think." Sifra thought she heard a moment of hesitation, the faintest pause in the otherwise steady speech. Is he starting to falter? "Can you tell me why the Dauntless Vanguard play it this way?" His question seemed casual, but Sifra reminded herself that this was part of her testing. Why would the Dauntless Vanguard play this strange silent version? Even as she thought about it, tiles were moving and swapping, every move inscrutable to outsiders. "It's practice for communicating with your comrades without alerting the enemy," she said, confident in her answer if not the location of the shield tile. "If I can warn you, or command you with just a glance, well, maybe we can save lives in the field." Sifra felt not exactly comfortable, but like she had handled on this way of playing the game at last. It was difficult, but she knew what she was doing, and it goes further than that, I think. She continued, "I used to think Tellstones was a game of memorization. It was when my father taught me. I practiced every day, working hard like a Demacian ought. When I played in the Nymph Battalion, I realised that it wasn't just about that. It was about planning your actions and anticipating your opponent." Merrick nodded again. The stones danced between them. "But it's not just that either, is it?" she asked. He answered her question, and no hint of his earlier hesitation remained. "It's about courage. Your courage. My courage. Skill is important, but skill without courage is nothing. For example," he reached out and knocked twice on the tree stump. "The boast." Someone in the huge crowd around them gasped before being shushed by their neighbour. The sun was low on the horizon, and raptors were crying in the distance. Silver wings, far from home. Merrick's blue eyes sparkled and held her grey-eyed gaze steadily. Sifra searched for the doubt she thought she'd seen before. She searched her heart for her own courage and finally found plenty. Born of the skills that she honed for years, she raised her hand and responded. 1 knock. 2. It was now his turn to decide whether he believed Sifra knew the stones as she claimed. She whirled every last grain of certainty into her eyes for him to read. He smiled and slowly swept his gaze across the tiles, demanding she prove it. She reached for the tiles in order, left to right. Hammer, scales, sword. She named them just before turning them face up, each one a testament to her skill. Banner, knight. Again, she was right, but somewhere in the last 2 were the shield and the crown, and for all her practice, skill, and determination, she was unsure which was which. She hesitated. "Well?" Merrick's voice betrayed nothing. Her hand resting on the 6th piece, she took a deep breath and called, Shield. It was the crown. The crowd around them erupted into cheers and commiserations, outrage and disbelief. Sifra herself sat stunned, her stomach as heavy as the backpack of rocks engraved with her comrades' names. People she'd failed, friends she'd just let down. She'd proven unworthy to carry their names. Merrick leaned over the table, stern voice clearly audible over the commotion, played with courage, played like a dauntless vanguard. I look forward to our next game.